You are not the dancer, you are the song, not the one who sang. Be a beautiful songbird. No, you tell the truth.
Welcome, everyone. This is Thrive with Morella, the show for people who want to thrive body, mind, heart, and spirit. As parents, teachers, as adults who care for the children in our lives, we can probably all agree that while learning, tests, and achievement are important, there is more to helping kids to thrive in life than just getting good grades. And so I'm wondering if you've ever considered what can happen in a classroom when meditation is incorporated into the fabric of the learning experience. What are the results for students? Is meditation in the classroom just about stress management for kids, teaching them how to manage their stress or calm their minds, or might there be more? My guest today is William Meyer. He has long taught history, economics, and humanities in urban and suburban high schools, where he has also taught meditation in a variety of forms. Bill has worked with fellow educators in workshops and professional development courses, and he's also the author of 2 published middle reader novels and is currently working to augment his MA in education from Harvard with a PhD from NYU, and wondering what wonderful things he will be doing with that. And he's also the author of this book, 3 Breaths and Begin, a guide to meditation in the classroom, which is available online now, and I've had the privilege of reading. Bill, welcome to Thrive with Morella. Oh, I do not have your audio on. There you go. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure to have you. And Bill, as I told you just before the show, I always like to start by asking my guests, what is one of your personal keys to thriving in life? And I'm going to ask you, not meditation, what's something else that you do to thrive in life?
Yeah, I appreciate the heads up. As I was reflecting on that, I think for me, it's this idea of space and just having space in my life to do what I am doing and to have time for what I'm doing, but also to have space for the relationships in my life, to have space for connection and time to myself. And I also think just being in specific physical spaces like nature also re-energizes and renews the work that I do. So I think there's a lot of layers to that answer, but this idea of how important space is and sort of transitioning from a doing, because you can become very occupied in all the things you're doing in your life, and just every once in a while sitting and just being in space is something that I think is so important to my work, my life, my relationships.
I so agree. For me, the idea of spaciousness is it's almost like a luxurious word, but it just really allows us to be, as opposed to, constantly be running from one thing to the next. So thank you for starting us off with that.
Yeah, totally.
So I'm just in awe, in amazement of what you're doing with meditation in your classroom. And I loved reading your book, and I thought I'd start by mentioning something you say early in the book and have that kind of get us started, because you mentioned how the Egyptians and other ancient cultures believed that the power of the individual resides not in the head, but in the heart. And I wanted to ask you to expand on that. Why does the power of an individual lie in his heart rather than his head, and how does meditation help with that?
Yeah, there's so many times I've done book talks with kids in my middle grade books, and I often start with that story of mummification and how the Egyptians would never touch the heart. And this idea over time, it seems like as we've progressed or modernized in education, we've just moved further and further up in the body, and now we really only focus on the head, and only part of the head at that, when we're educating students. And there's a whole center of knowledge that I believe resides in the heart, but it's only knowledge that an individual can access themselves. It's within that space, within the heart space, that the experiences that students are having in their lives in the summer outside of school, that those experiences can be processed, internalized, and that's where you get wisdom. And for me, this is what a lot of ancient cultures understood, in a way that we are very cerebral, and we believe, like, if it can't be measured, if it can't be quantified, then it doesn't have value within our society. And I think the consequence of this is you see just a larger discourse within the country, but within the world, that's just lost that connection to the heart. So decisions are something might make sense in the head that doesn't resonate with the heart. And for me, a big part of education is bringing students back into their bodies, but more than anything, bringing them back into their hearts, letting them access their own tuition, their own knowing about what they're learning and discovering in life.
That's beautiful. And I was thinking it connects with another question that I have for you later, but I can't find it right now. So we'll get to it. We'll get to it later. But, you know, of course, reading through your book, I know that you do different kinds of meditations, that they don't all look the same. But I thought that perhaps for our audience, people who maybe have never even considered, teachers or parents who might be listening, who might not ever have considered the idea of meditation being integral to a class. And you're a history teacher, right? So can you share with us, just some of the basics of your meditation program? How often? What's the setting? How soon do you introduce it to a class? Is it required? Can you tell us about kind of the fundamentals of how you brought it in?
Yeah, there's a lot of layers to this, but one of the core pieces is the meditation club, and that's where a lot of this work began. And that's a club that within the school meets every Wednesday at lunch, and it's open to anyone in the building. And at times we've had administrators, secretaries, parents come into that space, and that's just a simple 10-15 minute long meditation, which often begins with the breath. And that's something I mentioned in the book, but I would encourage anyone who's thinking about introducing this work into their classrooms or into their own lives or the lives of their students or kids, start with the breath work. And then I often use the breath as a vehicle to deepen into the body, checking in with sensations in the body, physical sensations that can be very grounding, even someone's connection to the earth, their feet on the ground. And from that space, you can sort of take a big leap and start to move into these deeper visualizations. And for example, just last week, we had our final meditation club meeting of the year. And we did this beautiful meditation where we reflected on all the places our feet had been over the course of the 10 months school. All the things we'd stood for, all the things we'd supported, all the things we'd held in our hearts, all the things we'd said, and even all the things we hadn't said. So I find that starting with the breath, moving into the body, and then you can enter this really expansive place of the imagination. Now that's within the meditation club. When I use meditation in the classroom, it's so important to set sort of the norms of the class. And going back to that idea of space that I mentioned at the beginning, students have to feel they're in a safe space. Meditation is not something to just lead with unless you have a relationship with the students and they have a relationship and trust with you. I mean, you're asking them to close their eyes and you yourself are closing yours, which is pretty scary when you're dealing with a bunch of adolescents. But once those norms are established, just general classroom norms, I often introduce meditation instead of a movie right before a holiday. Everyone else is showing movies, and that's where I sort of began. I thought, I'm going to do a meditation, see what happens. And it's always framed as an invitation. It's never an obligation. Everything's an invitation. And I say to students, as long as you're breathing, you're doing it right. And everything else is up to you. And even when we reflect after meditations, which I mentioned is such an important part of the process, even more than actually the experience, it's always an invitation. Students always have the option to pass, although very rarely does that happen. And it's amazing to see how after a guided meditation, different students have complementary experiences that sort of build a tapestry, a collective experience within the class, and they build on one another. It's some of the most powerful parts of the work. So always starting simple, always starting where you feel most comfortable, and most importantly, that the students feel most comfortable.
Yeah, and it's beautiful. I was actually had made a note and underlined it, how you mentioned that deep reflection on any subject doesn't happen by chance. And so that through your practice, what you're mentioning is you're really engaging them and teaching them how to reflect on what's occurring, being present and reflect. And I imagine the conversation, the dialogue probably evolves over time.
Yeah, and I think that's just a lost art within our schools, and maybe even broadly with adults and all of us in general. This art of reflection. I mean, there's a lot of rumination, and there's a lot of grinding, and there's a lot of obsessing, but it's not this thoughtful, spacious place where we look at something objectively and we can honor it, whether it was good or bad. And we don't have to own it, and then we can let it go. And I think that's so important for students.
Right. Yeah, and what you're talking about is completely different from the kind of hamster wheel of the mind that we can all get caught up in, just like ruminating about our problems or the challenges, and just thinking the same thoughts over and over and over. And what you're teaching them is completely different. Not only through.
Yeah, I experienced that firsthand. I mean, I teach AP classes, and it's just like it can become an endless drive of content and coverage unless we have to model that as adults. We are sort of the keepers of this space for kids. And if we don't own that, if we don't honor that, if we don't create space for that, how are we to expect that they're going to find that, or they will do that in their own lives?
So then you typically wait for a holiday to start a meditation, do it by invitation when your relationship with the students has been established and there's an element of trust. Do you then meditate with them weekly, or do you meditate with them at several points during the semester? Like, do you have any rhyme or reason as to when and how you meditate with them?
Yeah, I definitely try to build it as very an intentional part of the curriculum. Never an afterthought, never, we've got 10 minutes left in this class, let's meditate. First of all, I think the level of preparation that's required for someone to guide a meditation means even that morning, I'm just more aware of what I'm doing, what I'm eating, even the amount of caffeine I'm drinking and consuming. There's a larger awareness. But when I do meditate, what I try to do is build it around the curriculum a lot, particularly in my history class. So I'll often meditate when we're doing a longer unit or we're doing a longer research paper over weeks and maybe even months. I'll have sort of a beginning meditation at the beginning of that research paper, which is an opportunity to sort of connect in a different way with the topic. We'll revisit that in the middle of the paper with questions that might remain unanswered. And then the last piece is I always end with sort of a gratitude meditation. This sounds very odd, but to offer gratitude for the opportunity to connect with that topic in that way, or that individual. And building that structure of threes, like a beginning, a middle, and an after, in any unit, I think it sort of resonates with students, and they can expect and they can find the rhythm of the meditation. And I do that now in my humanities class, which is a big part of it is exploring issues of equity and social justice. I really try to use the meditations to sort of deepen students' experience within their service placements, because then it's an opportunity to explore self and identity when often they're working in communities of different identities from their own.
Right.
So the same thing, but in that case, the meditation almost becomes like every 2 weeks we'll come back to a meditation and revisit similar questions to see how their ideas of self or understanding have deepened. So I would just go with your, intuition as a teacher about what feels appropriate and right. Trust regularly.
Yeah. So your audio was breaking up a little bit, but I think what you were saying is, as a teacher, go with your intuition to what feels with regards to what feels right for your curriculum and your class.
Yeah,
so it might be slightly different.
Exactly.
And so there were two things that you were touching on that lead to questions that I had for you. One was, I loved that when you lead guided meditations around a particular project, as you were just talking about this, beginning, middle, and end, project that they're working on, you ask them to write 3 questions before the meditation starts. I don't know if you do it every time, but you mentioned how you have them all write down 3 questions. So can you talk about the purpose of the questions and what they achieve through the process of writing these questions and then going into meditation?
Well, I really feel like questions are sort of the doorway into the mind and doorway into the imagination.
I agree.
If I were just to, this is the world you live in, right? And so if I were just to go into it, no questions, I think you remove that intentionality and that prep piece that's so important. Like, there's something academic, there's something inquisitive, curious that we're going to explore. And the questions seem to ground the experience. And I use the questions throughout the meditation to come back to them. So students can be having so many different experiences. What I like to do is guide them back to the time that they're researching. Mm-hmm. And then they're all having different visual experiences or meditative, reflective experiences. And the questions become a personal way of individualizing the experience.
Mm-hmm. Can you give us some ideas of the questions that they ask or that you might suggest that they ask?
Yeah, great story. I had a student, she was looking, this is a public school, and the story I'm going to give is a religious example, but I work in a public school, and she was researching St. Teresa, and particularly Bernini's statue of Teresa, the Ecstasy of Teresa. Yeah. This is a Baroque piece. And her question was, did she really have these visions or voices? Mm-hmm. And I always ask students, please ask questions you can't answer, you haven't been able to find in the textbook. And that's important as well, because it's hard for them to believe a question can't be answered. Google can't answer the question, right? So you're trying to really push those boundaries. And when she did that guided meditation, she felt very strongly through her experience, both with like what she felt was engaging with that topic, is like there's a basis for these voices and the experience that this historical figure was having, and it's supported by the fact of this incredibly negative response she was getting for having this experience as a woman in the 16th and in the 15th century. So I think I could have communicated or told her that in one level, but for her, whatever allowed her to access that, and maybe that was something she'd come across unknowingly in her research, and in the meditation was able to surface it, it was internalized, and it was something she had personally found. Like, she owned it. Right. And I think that's what's really powerful about meditation. It's that inner space that they own. Mm-hmm. We've taken so much from students, and there's very little autonomy that they have in their lives, from even what they're doing, sports, everything. And so for that, they go inward, they get to find the answer, or not, but it's theirs that they get to own.
Right. And what I love about you using questions is that you're really opening up their ability to explore and to be in the question. I'm one of the things I do, I'm a hypnotherapist among other things, but I have observed when you give the subconscious mind a question, it'll, start looking in the background. It's going to start, like a computer looking for the answer. And so you move into meditation. And so that question is already drawing them into a place that they would have not accessed with their kind of rational thinking mind. And I love, I hadn't thought about asking questions and going into meditation, but now I might.
Well, there was one other piece that we actually didn't include in the book, but it was this lengthy story about a student, and he had asked a question about the 30 Years' War, and he ended up seeing just a building, and he drew a picture of this building, and we came out of the meditation, and he said, all I have is this image, and I said, why don't you see if you can find it? The next day he came back, he'd found the image, it was connected to the 30 Years' War, and a figure that he didn't even know was part of the war totally changed the trajectory of his research. And I think that exactly what you're saying and how it complements and builds on itself.
Right. And that you're empowering them to be the owner of the research, of the knowledge that they're finding. So yeah, I can imagine it really sinking it much more deeply. The other piece that you touched on that I found really interesting as I was reading your book is that you talk about how, between what you see in maybe middle school and then going into high school, that kids somehow start losing their sense of wonder and curiosity. And that, as they're developing, and I wanted to read a section of the book, but I didn't write down the page. But you're talking about how during those really critical years in high school, they're really starting to get influenced at a critical time in their identity development and their self-development. And you talk about how meditation really helps them both with that sense of wonder and curiosity, but also with their sense of self, their exploration of self. Can you talk about that? What you're seeing in bringing meditation to kids as they're in these formative years and their sense of identity?
I work in a K through 12 school, so I'm very lucky. If I turn right out of my classroom, I end up in the elementary school. If I go left, I'm at the high school. And if I were to go into most of the elementary school classes and I asked a classroom, how many of you are artists? In a third grade class, almost all of them would raise their hand. When I asked that of my 11th or 12th grade students, I'd be lucky to see one or two. And the question is, what happens over the course of those 50 feet where all of a sudden sort of these possibilities, this creativity, this knowing is lost? And I see this in high school, even between 9th and 12th grade, where students start to internalize these false identities, or I'm good at math, I'm bad at history, and vice versa. And often it has very little to do with them, but more of who's teaching the class or what they're experiencing. And I think what meditation is about in many ways, and what it offers is this inner exploration of the self. Is one, it's a reconnecting to our own selves and our own knowing. We're no longer empowering someone else or a grade or a number to define whether my day's good or bad because I got a 90 on this test, or this teacher said that this was good, or this teacher didn't like this. And now I'm the one who has a sense of what is good and what is bad, right? I have a sense of what is true for me and what is not true. And I have a sense of sort of my own voice, my own authorship of my life. And it's just like those questions you had mentioned. It's how do we keep students open? How do we keep them open as long as possible? How do we keep those third graders and those 12th graders just as expansive? And I think what some of the meditation does is it not only begins to quiet a lot of that distortion that exists outside of themselves, that ends up shaping their own identity, but it also lets them to reconnect to those pieces within themselves that are always there and always were there, and those pieces that they feel are possible and true for who they are. And I think in that space, these meditations can be so important to breaking false identity, right, and helping students come back to what's authentic and true for them.
Right. Well, because I think, I'm listening to you thinking like, oh, geez, this would have been so great for me in high school, because you're talking about the identity that gets developed. One part of it is the scholastic experience that shapes, what we believe is true about ourselves based on the grades that we're getting, right? Yeah. But then the other piece is also the socialization piece, and what we start to believe is true about ourselves by what other people are doing, what we're supposed to be doing, what we're supposed to be like, whether we're in the right clique or not. If it's like all of these things that, can be in many cases, very negative. And if I know for myself, if I had had the opportunity to explore meditation, which didn't come to me until much later, actually in college, but, it would have created a space precisely for what you're saying, to kind of discover which I'm sure is doing for all these kids, discover their own voice, their own sense of self that is not about the grades, that's not about what the other kids are doing, that, gives them space to find something that's true for them.
And I see that all the time with adults that I work with. I do a lot of work with parent groups. And I think when we're just being introduced to these practices as adults, there are years and decades of our lives where we've lived outside of ourselves. And it takes a lot longer to sort of undo those pieces. Where with students, the students, like, they're a tough crowd. But if you can win them over and they see something tangible, they will drop in ways that adults can never achieve. I mean, and the possibilities are really endless. So I think it's so important to have that intervention or that tool and that access to them when they're young. And I look back at my own life, and I think one of the reasons I'm a history teacher, it speaks to me, or I find myself in this world, is because that was such a formative time in my own life. And the things that I'm making sense of in my life today were things that I was introduced to when I was 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. And if we can be more intentional about those things we're introduced to, we can help students think about the things that they're experiencing and process them. Think about where they will be as adults and human beings within our communities and our society.
Right. So for our audience, if you're just joining us, my guest is William Meyer. He is the author of this book, 3 Breaths and Begin, for our friends on TV and YouTube that are watching. The book is 3 Breaths and Begin, A Guide to Meditation in the Classroom. And it really is a guidebook. I love how you have scripts for different kinds of meditations and suggestions for, school outings and in the classroom, and even, for... don't you hate that you almost have to write this in the book, but what happens when there's a tragedy, when there's a terrible event at school, and you provide chakra meditations and so many other different scripts. We have a couple more minutes on TV, but for our TV viewers, you can continue listening to the conversation on the radio 99.3 FM in Burlington, and also on the Thrive with Morella podcast and the YouTube channel as well. So, Bill, what do you do when a teenager starts snickering in the meditation, or when you maybe have that kind of defiance? How do you handle that?
I keep meditating, and it's some of the hardest pieces to go forward, but it's almost particularly with the younger kids. Actually, I should say with middle school students, which I find the most difficult group to work with in many ways, because there's just so much uncertainty about their own identity and their own place within their community and their classrooms. That often manifests itself in like a snickering or laughter. But what's funny, or what's true about it, as I continue and as the meditation deepens, there's a collective energy that almost becomes overwhelming. And there's never been a meditation where I've ever had to stop.
Right.
And there's never been a meditation that students haven't dropped into it. And I think setting up that space very intentionally before it begins, creating that circle with chairs, explaining to students what's about to take place and why you find it as valuable as any test or any piece of content you're going to cover, they generally are on board, and I think they can see that and experience that.
Oh, your video just froze on me. I don't know if I lost you all of a sudden, but we are going to wrap up for our TV audience. My guest today is William Meyer, and his book is 3 Breaths and Begin, A Guide to Meditation in the Classroom. It's available online, and you can also find more information about Bill on his website, which is billpmeyer.com. And I think we just completely lost our... there we go. We completely lost the Zoom feed, but we're back.
I think it really is a response to the Common Core, which I think most teachers would agree is well-intentioned, but the application of it is deeply problematic and has only created more tests and more stress within the lives of students. And I think it pretty well researched has showed less learning. And to me, a contemplative core is about sort of shifting the direction of what's going on within schools. And while it does sound like pie in the sky, I mean, we're trying to make that a reality. And one of the ways that I find it is, or bringing that into my own schools, we're developing a whole service component across the K through 12 experience, and trying to be very intentional and scaffolded and reflective about how students understand service and their place within those experiences. And so next year, we're actually offering a whole series of seminar workshops built around issues of social justice, equity, access, education, gender, race, that have reflective pieces within them. So in this seminar, it's not just about exploring the community, but it's about exploring the self through things like journaling, reflection, meditation, so that one can be of even greater benefit to their community and the broader community as they understand it. So I think those principles that I laid out are really foundational to the work and the teacher that I want to be, and what I think we can bring into our schools more broadly.
And it really speaks to what you were talking about at the very beginning, is this idea of the power being in the heart, and to helping kids develop and acquire wisdom as opposed to just book knowledge, right? But to know themselves as really the writers of the creators of their lives. And I think it's extraordinary. So I'd love to see where you are and where your school is in a few years, and see how this unfolds. Because, our kids aren't testing well, aren't showing good results compared to other countries, developed countries that have a little bit more unschooling.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing is also just sort of, not only are the students testing or what they're learning is not really applicable to the future. Right. And what we're failing to teach and nurture is compassion. And I'm not just talking about compassion towards others. There's a lack of self-compassion. Right. And often I teach an online course to high school students called Beyond Mindfulness, and I mention it in the book. And this is a hybrid course that meets in person 3 times, but online each week. And the students develop a meditation practice. They actually lead a guided meditation to the class. But almost all of them, when they do their final reflections, mention a series of podcasts and TED Talks that I show around judgment and how that resonates with them, particularly this idea of self-judgment. And they are being judged from a very young age, and they are marinating or soaking in this judgment, and it becomes these burdens that they carry. And I think that also speaks to why they have these false identities. They are so afraid of failing, or whatever failing has become in their own minds and in their own definition, right, as a result of that. So it's such important work. Yeah,
such important work. And, you talk about also, the beauty of this, but also that there can be a wrong time or a wrong space to do it. And you mentioned how, and you touched on it earlier today, where you mentioned how if a classroom, there might not be, the classroom might not be ready, that on page 41, I remember marking it, where you say that, meditation won't fix lingering disciplinary problems within the classroom. In fact, existing issues are often deepened by classroom meditation. You'll meet significant obstacles. So if you have a teacher who's listening to this and has a really challenging classroom and they would like to explore this, what would be your advice?
I would modify the practice to what's appropriate for them. And I would try to, before I began a meditation, try to build silence into the class. Try to build, whether that's like reading quietly, writing, or reflective writing at some place or some time. But those become the foundational components, which then when you transition asking students to sit quietly with their breath or themselves, they're more comfortable with that. But just beginning to find space and even being intentional about the space that you are creating as a teacher. Unfortunately, and I've spent a lot of time in schools of teacher education, a lot of it's about filling this space, not creating the space or opening the space or sitting with the question. It's how much you can cover, how much you can do, and you create lesson plans that literally I have created lesson plans that break down it by minute, over 80 minutes.
Oh, wow.
And that just, that deconstructs our own humanity, but it also takes away from the possibilities that exist. So I think, particularly for really challenging classes, in my head, I see turning the lights off and having students write. And after they watch something, and you don't have to be the one guiding it. It could be something that's guided through a YouTube video or a clip, and then they can write down a reflection or experience. And I think you just have to meet students where they're at.
Right. So something you said just got me wondering what meditation, and particularly bringing meditation into your classroom, has done for you as a teacher.
It's renewed my teaching in a way that I never could have imagined. And I find myself at the center of the community in a way I never could have imagined. I not only lead meditations for students, but I lead this Thursday night group for parents. And this is what I find meaningful. I always say to the students, the curriculum is secondary. Like, it's all about you. And for me, meditation is a way to connect with them on a level that I never had imagined before. And it has deepened everything I do. And as a teacher, it's so important, I think, to nurture ourselves and to find ways to bring ourselves into the classroom. And when we are our most authentic self, that resonates with students, and they feel that, they want to be with that, they want to be that themselves. And that, for me, is what meditation has allowed.
Wow. Bill, what you're giving them, as you're saying, the curriculum is secondary, because what you're giving them in your authenticity, and in giving them a tool for them to get to know themselves and be in this exploration of themselves and reflection process. I mean, you're really giving them a tool for a lifetime that, like you said, many of us don't find until much later in life. Sometimes because when we're in the middle of deep struggles and needing someone to throw us a bone, and so we find this, and you're giving it to them at such a formative stage. So it's such an extraordinary thing you're doing.
Oh, thanks for saying that. I mean, I really feel like they have given me so much, and working with kids is so empowering, because it is a space where you have to be true. Like, you have to be in alignment with yourself. Because when you're not, you'll get that instant feedback from them that it's not resonating. And that, it just keeps me honest, I guess, is the best way to describe it.
Right.
I would not be the practitioner. I would not be the parent. I would not be the teacher. I would not be the son that I am today had it not been for these experiences. And I probably, their interest, their curiosity has deepened my own. There's a couple weeks ago, there's one student who came from meditation club, and I thought, oh, it's not going to happen. And, it'll just be like a one-on-one meditation. And always, students always show up. And I think that's, in a larger sense, that's the way to look at it and think about schools. Like, they always show up. If we offer it to them, if we give them the space, they'll rise and they'll fill it and do something with it that we couldn't imagine. And I think that's what this offers them in many ways.
Right. So to wrap up, I want to ask you, because you've taken students to meditate in some pretty cool places. So what's been your favorite?
Well, I noticed on your website some sacred geometry, and
Yes.
I do a lot of stuff with sacred geometry in my ninth grade world history class. But the coolest place was definitely the tour in Glastonbury, and meditating on top of the tour with students, laying there in a circle on their backs was a surreal experience for me. It was really the whole trip. Was very surreal. But it was, again, they were the ones who requested it.
Wow.
I didn't go into that space thinking, oh, I'm going to lead a meditation on top of the tour. Okay, everyone get in a circle. They were the ones who thought, Mr. Meyer, this would be a great place to meditate. Can we meditate? And that often is sort of the response I get now. And now I get classes who are upset if I meditate with one class but don't meditate with the other class. So it's really pretty cool.
That's amazing. Oh, I love that story even better now, because I did obviously read it in the book, and you have a few other ones that are really extraordinary. But I love hearing that they actually asked for it, and to think of the power that they're asking for it. How incredible that would have been for them, that they had the desire and the calling in of that exploration in that space, and then creating it in such a sacred spatial spot. So
oh yeah, so powerful.
So Bill, is there anything we haven't touched on today that you think is a must?
I just think I think the most important piece for me is it's not about bringing meditation into every classroom. But it is about bringing maybe a more authentic version of ourselves as teachers and adults into these spaces. And whether that means being vulnerable or being honest or uncertain, that is a real gift to students in a way that nothing else we do can communicate and really touch and model growth in their lives.
Right. Yeah, it's beautiful, because you're speaking about modeling humanity, modeling being a human being with challenges and not having all the answers and working it out and being fallible and vulnerable. So thank you. It's a beautiful note to end with.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
So for everyone just joining us or catching up, my guest today is William Meyer. His book is 3 Breaths and Begin, a guide to meditation in the classroom. And as I mentioned, the book is filled with meditation scripts, ideas on how to implement meditation in schools, in the classroom, in a variety of settings. Really wonderful book. And clearly you're doing incredible work in the world with your students, with your community, and it's been a delight and a privilege to have you.
Oh, thank you so much. I feel so lucky to have this opportunity as well.
Wonderful. Delightful to have you. So for our